Hello, everybody. I would like to welcome you to today's presentation on behalf of the German-Turkish Academic Association and the Institute of Economic and Social History, which is represented by Professor Hartmut Berghoff. Professor Berghoff will be moderating, while Professor Şevket Pamuk is delivering his presentation about the Turkey's economic development since 1950. A recorded version of this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel. Dear Professor Berghoff and dear Professor Pamuk, the screens are yours.
Yeah, I also like to welcome you. You're also this special event. It's the last session in our colloquium. So we left the best for the last session. And we're really happy to welcome Professor Şevket Pamuk from the Bosporus University of Istanbul. It is a great honor for us to have you here. And I will say a few words about you. You graduated from Yale University, and then you went to the other coast in the US to Berkeley. Wonderful place that I know myself. You earned an MA in economics and a PhD in economics at the University of California at Berkeley. You took up a professorship in Istanbul and a little bit later also at the London School of Economics. Your areas of interest are Ottoman economy, Turkish economy, the economic history of the Middle East, long-term economic growth and institutions in Turkey. You have published in many of the leading journals of our field. And 2 years ago, you published a book called Uneven Centuries: Economic Development in Turkey since 1820 with Princeton University Press. And today you're going to talk about Turkey's economic development since 1950. And before we start, I like to thank Cenk Sancak and Kazim Eçer from the German-Turkish Academic Association for bringing us together, for organizing this talk. Thank you very much for that. And without further ado, I'd like to pass the microphone to Professor Pamuk, and the floor, so to speak, the virtual floor is all yours. Thank you very much.
Professor Berghoff, thank you so much for this kind introduction. I am grateful and I'm very much honored to be invited by the university. And I also want to thank the German-Turkish Academic Association and Mr. Cenk Sancak, and also Dr. Logeman for inviting me. I am going to talk about Turkey's economic development since 1950, with some background going back to the earlier period as well. I think at this point, I should begin by sharing my screen. Okay.
Yes, it's there. We can see it.
Yes. Okay.
Very good.
Okay. So I hope to talk for about 45 minutes. It's 5 past the hour, and but I will try to stop somewhere in the middle. And if there are any questions, especially about the graph, some of the graphs, or short questions, I will be happy to answer them. But the longer questions, I will try to respond to at the end of my talk. So my talk today begins with this graph about economic history of humankind for the last 2,000 years. You can see that something unusual happened during the last 200 years, that income per capita, GDP per capita, all around the world began to rise rapidly 2 centuries ago with the Industrial Revolution. And not only that incomes began to rise, but we entered an era of sustained economic growth. And economic historians, economists see technological change and the diffusion of the new technology as the main proximate cause of economic growth during the modern era, during these 200 years. However, as you can see in this graph, not different countries achieved very different levels of economic growth, economic prosperity during the last 2 centuries. So economists have been talking ever since not only about this process, but also why some countries did better than others and so on. And this is really the topic of my talk. As Professor Berghoff pointed out, I published a book in Turkish about 6 years ago, and then I rewrote it in English. And I'm going to base most of my talk on these books, the latter, the English book, but I will try to go a little bit, I will try to add a little bit at the end. So I'll begin with a little bit of introduction to Turkey as far as economic history or as far as economic development is concerned. We all know Turkey is a large country, a large developing country. And Turkey has had no colonial rule, so it has been formally independent the last 2 centuries, an earlier period. Turkey has had no oil or no really strong mineral resources. And economic policies of Turkey in the last 2 centuries and more recent period have not been very different from most other developing countries. Okay? And on the basis of these and a number of other things, one can reasonably say that Turkey is a good case study for addressing issues facing developing countries. Turkey's experience in this area is relevant for most other developing countries, and it is in this spirit that I will discuss the case of Turkey today. I want to show at the beginning that long-term rates of economic growth in Turkey have remained close to, but a little above averages for developing countries during the last 2 centuries and also since 1950. And then I want to offer a short explanation for this. I want to point out that ultimately technological change, rising rates of investment, structural change explain both the increases in income per capita, but also the fact that Turkey did not do significantly better than average during this period, both the last 2 centuries, but also since 1950. And then I want to also explore some of the deeper reasons, deeper causes for this performance. And I will argue that economic variables alone cannot explain this pattern that Turkey did close to a little above, but close to averages, and that I'm going to focus on politics and institutions as perhaps one of the main causes for why Turkey did not do better than average or close to average during the last, since 1950. Here is the long-term graph for Turkey's GDP per capita, the last 2 centuries. The green line, you can see, has a lower slope. That means Turkey's income per capita, GDP per capita, was rising at a lower rate, roughly until 1950, until after World War II, at a rate of less than 1% per year, 1% per year. But since 1950, the rate of annual increase has been in the range of 2.5% to 3%, as you can see from the slope, the red line. Okay. And this is the second graph, compares Turkey, the red line is Turkey, the red broken line, compares Turkey with world averages and developing country averages. All 3 lines in this graph are in terms of percentages of Western Europe and the United States, as percent of Western Europe and the United States. In this graph, you can see that Turkey's trajectory has been very close to world averages, and only since 1950, Turkey has done a little better than world averages in the more recent period. But in the 19th century, a little bit, Turkey has been close to world averages, a little above developing country averages during these last 2 centuries. I have a few more graphs for you. This one puts many of the countries that you might think of comparing. You can see again, in the 19th, this is all these countries' curves are in terms for each of the benchmark years in terms of percentage of averages for Western Europe and the United States. In the 19th century, you can see this red line going in the southeast direction, meaning until about 1950, until the 1930s, the gap between Turkey and Western Europe is increasing. And then roughly since 1950, the gap between Western Europe and the United States on the one hand and Turkey on the other hand, it has been declining. Turkey has been moderately catching up since 1950 with the European and United States averages. This U-shaped curve is remarkably similar for all the countries in my sample. They are the same for Italy and Japan and Spain. What they suggest is that in the 19th century, industrialization in Turkey and in these other countries was slower, and it began later. As a result, the gap between them, the individual countries, and the averages for Western Europe and the United States increased. But since 1950, the gap, at least in the case of Turkey, has been closing. But you can see already in this graph, Turkey's catch-up has not been as strong as it is for Italy or Spain or for Japan or South Korea. Turkey is not in that category of very successful countries since 1950. And in this graph, in fact, I decided to compare the case of Turkey with 4 other countries, 2 in Southern Europe, and then 2 in the Middle East. I chose these countries because of Their size, population was similar to that of Turkey. And you can see here that when I first drew this graph, what impressed me was how little things changed in 200 years. The ranking of these 5 countries has been remarkably stable over the last 2 centuries. But you can see again, Turkey has been catching up with Western Europe and United States as its percentage of income, as expressed in terms of percentages for Western Europe and United States, has been rising since 1950. But Turkey has not been as successful, and Italy and Spain has done better than Iran and Egypt since 1950. Okay. And I will focus in the rest of my presentation more on the period since 1950. But of course, these days, economists and economic historians do not consider income, GDP per capita, as the only yardstick for long-term economic performance. Health, education, human development more broadly are often important criteria for comparison. So I thought it would be useful to compare Turkey's performance in life expectancy at birth, which is considered the key measure for health. You can see this in this red line, how life expectancy at birth in Turkey was still about 44 years after World War II, 44 years here in 1950, after rising slowly from less than 30. But since 1950, life expectancy has been rising very rapidly, and today is about 75, 76, a little higher for women, lower for men by about 4 years. But in this yardstick as well, you measure as well, you can see how closely Turkey tracked world averages during the last 2 centuries. Only in recent decades, Turkey's life expectancy, or more generally health, has exceeded that of the world. And then I have also education, because it matters, schooling, literacy, education, it matters for long-term economic development. You see here literacy rate for men, average, and women, and you can see how rapidly in the 20th century literacy rates have risen. However, if we compare Turkey, we are unable to make comparisons over literacy rates because data is lacking for many other countries. But what international comparisons are done in terms of the average years of schooling of adult population. And here I've summarized the most recent international trends. You can see Turkey's average years of schooling for the adult population have increased in the second half of the 20th century, but they have lagged behind world averages for all of this period. So this is something to think about when discussing Turkey's pattern of economic development. Now, I am going to explore the causes of economic growth, proximate causes and deeper causes, but I am happy to stop here, take questions. If you have any questions about any of these graphs, Professor Berghoff, if you find anyone willing to ask a question, I'll be happy to answer any short questions about these graphs.
Yeah, I suggest you ask your questions directly. If there are any questions. for short remarks. Thing is, I can't see all of you.
Okay. Okay, then I'm going to continue, and then
okay.
we can take up everything at the end.
Very good.
Now,
okay.
And now I'm going to explore an explanation, the proximate causes and deeper causes of this pattern. A, the fact that Turkey's incomes have increased. We go back to this one, per capita income in Turkey has increased more than tenfold in 2 centuries. Since 1950, per capita incomes in Turkey have increased more than sixfold. But these increases have been close to world averages. So I want to both take into account the fact that incomes have been rising, but also they have been rising at rates close to a little above averages. And I want to distinguish between the proximate causes, which is basically the rate at which investment takes place, productivity increases, but then I want to also discuss some of the deeper causes, economic policies, institutions, the social and political environment. Now, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, at the end of it all, the different rates at which incomes have risen around the world in the last 2 centuries or since 1950 reflect the rate at which new technologies have spread around the world and how much they spread in each society, to what extent each society developed the capacity to adopt and use the recent technology, or perhaps technologies that are not so recent. And of course, one big cause of this, proximate cause of this, is the investment rate. What percentage of a country's GDP is set aside every year for investment in physical plant and equipment. And you can see how this investment rate has been rising in Turkey. It was 2 centuries ago, it was below 5%. Around 1950, it was 10-11% of GDP, and it has risen to about 20%, and it's been averaging 20-22% in recent decades. But I should also remind you that when you look at a country like China, which has been growing much more rapidly than Turkey, until recently, the investment rate, same investment rate in China was closer to 40%. So clearly, Turkey has done about average in the investment rate as well. In recent decades, the investment rate has been rising, but has not risen to higher levels. And of course, another important proximate cause of this diffusion of technology is, again, the education, average schooling of adult population. And again, this explains not only for men, but for both women and men. Until recently, Turkey has not done very well in this area. So for that reason, Turkey's economy exhibits as standard technology or low technology production and relatively low innovation. And as in the case of most other developing countries, low total factor productivity growth, of which I will talk a little bit soon. So these are the proximate economic causes for the pattern I identified for Turkey's long-term pattern of development. past 2 centuries and since 1950. I want to now turn to some of the deeper causes, and these deeper causes, I will argue, are non-economic causes. Of course, economic development, economic growth is a very complex process, and I don't want to claim that there is a single cause, there is a single explanation. Obviously, there are many multiple causes, and these, I will try to identify some of the two of the most important causes. I will mention the first one, but I will really focus on the other one, the second one. The first cause I should mention, the first deeper cause I should mention is that this is something qualitative again, but it is not easy for developing countries, countries that are labeled late industrializers, to do very well. If you look around the world, there are very few examples, and most of these examples in the last 30, 40 years have been in East Asia. There are very few very successful countries which have caught up with the developed countries in the last century. Many people would argue that the fact that these developing countries, late industrializers, have to industrialize and raise their income in a world where there are already earlier industrializers and more powerful, stronger economies, that often makes the rules a little more difficult and the chances of success smaller. So that I would identify as one reason why Turkey has not done as well. The international global rules and institutions. But I want to focus more on some of the domestic reasons, political and social reasons for why Turkey hasn't done better since 1950. And I'm going to focus on institutions. And let me just say a few words here, especially for the parts of our audience tonight who are not economists, and institutions refer for economists. Institutions refer to written and unwritten rules and their enforcement in a society, like property rights, rule of law. These are written or unwritten codes of behavior, equality of opportunity. All these rules, quote unquote rules, are important because at the end of the day, they shape the extent to which a society and economy supports and encourages activities that enhance economic growth, whether individuals, groups in a society invest in physical capital, in human capital, whether they invest in new technology, in research, and productivity increases, depends on these rules. And that's this emphasis on the institutions, on these rules, is really a more recent emphasis in economics, but they carry a lot of truth for the case of Turkey. I want to identify this evening some of these rules, and I want to focus on political institutions in Turkey. Most economists would agree that stable, inclusive political institutions and a political regime is very important for long-term economic development. However, for the period since 1950, when Turkey experienced rapid urbanization, rapid structural change, Turkey also experienced persistent social tensions between different groups, changing different groups, and at times polarization. Turkey's weak political institutions and relatively fragile political regime have often led to, in this 70 years, to military coups and to decline of democracy. I'm not saying that this has been the case at all times, but there were periods of relative political stability, but also periods of instability and even disorder. And of course, these periods of political instability have interacted with the economy and have had negative, unfavorable consequences, economic consequences. Weak political institutions have interacted with political difficulties, and also political difficulties have interacted with economic policy, led to weaker economic policy, both at the micro and macro level. And I would also add here that these political difficulties have made it very difficult for Turkey's state to increase its capacity for leading economic development. I would argue that for late industrializers, quality of government interventionism, how well government intervenes in support of certain patterns of development is very important, but Turkey's recurring political difficulties have influenced the quality of government interventionism in Turkey. Now, for the period since 1950, I wanted to just remind you how Turkey since 1950 has been experiencing urbanization. These two curves refer to the share of urban population and share of the labor force in the urban economy in industry and services. Since 1950, share of agriculture has, in both the economy and in total population, has been declining, and share of urban economy, industry and services has been rising. You can see the same here. Green line shows the share of agriculture in Turkey's economy has been declining, and it now is it's about 8% now. So manufacturing has been rising, but manufacturing has risen to about 25%, and has been going sideways since the 1990s. This is something that has been happening in most other developing countries as well, with the exception of East Asia. In fact, because East Asian countries, including China, have been doing so well in this here, that life has become much more difficult, and industrialization has been much more difficult for countries like Turkey and other developing countries. And in the absence of stronger performance for industrialization, it's the services that has been accounting for more of employment and a higher share of GDP, shown by the blue line. So this is the pattern for the last 70 years. And in the last 70 years, Turkey has adopted two different kinds of economic policy from about 1950 here to 1980, the first 30 years. Turkey adopted what economists call inward-oriented policies, emphasizing domestic market-oriented industrialization. And you can see here how during this early period, Turkey's foreign trade had a smaller, lower share in the economy. Share of imports and exports in GDP were lower and even declining. But in the era of globalization since 1980, Turkey's economy has been turning outward, and share of exports and imports as a percentage of GDP have been rising since. So the one point I want to emphasize here is that in what follows, I will point out to some features of Turkey's politics, and these features basically apply to both of these periods, both the period since until 1980, when Turkey's economic policies were inward-oriented, and the period since 1980. Okay. From official GDP data, I have calculated the annual growth rate of GDP per capita in Turkey for the period since 1950. You can see there have been a lot of fluctuations. The average is 2.8% per annum. In other words, Turkey's average income has been rising, average rate of 2.8%, but there has been a lot of fluctuations over this average. Okay, all official data, I didn't really touch this, but there is an interesting pattern to this, and I want to explore this pattern. I have identified in this pattern cycles of high growth rates, periods of high growth rates, short periods of high growth rates, and I showed the period averages in black. Short periods of high growth rates followed by longer periods of lower growth rates. High, low, high, low, high, low. So I have identified 4 such cycles since 1950. I thought periods of rapid growth are followed by longer periods of lower rate of growth for GDP per capita. I thought I could, okay. I am trying to aim at the main source of these recurring cycles, these 4 cycles. I want to argue that each of the following may have contributed, but they are not the primary cause of these recurring cycles. Some of this is inevitably related to the world economy. Obviously, when the world economy enters periods of slow growth or negative growth, as it was during the last year, of course, they have an impact on Turkey. But I want to argue that this is not the primary cause of these recurring cycles in Turkey. As I pointed out, it is not the economic model, whether it was inward-oriented or interventionist or so-called neoliberal or world economy-oriented, that doesn't explain these recurring cycles. And of course, in the political economy literature, there is a reference to electoral business cycles, the idea that in a democratic multi-party regime, governments may try to exploit their power by, for example, they may want to enter elections at a good time for the economy, all of which may create business cycles and fluctuations in the economy. I would say each of these three causes may have contributed some, but they're not the main cause of the main source of the recurring cycles. And I will argue the main source is the politics. But let me identify one more measure, and this measure is total factor productivity growth, a measure for the quality of growth. I have superimposed on top of the fluctuations in GDP per capita the fluctuations, annual growth rates of total factor productivity. Total factor productivity is a broad measure economists use for increases in overall productivity in the economy. Well, we know that developing countries are not very good at increasing total factor productivity. In most developing countries, including Turkey, most of the increase in GDP per capita is due to accumulation of factors of production, investment in machinery, equipment, and then education, human capital, but not more productive use of the existing stock. And you can see the same here. Calculations, total factor productivity calculations done by others, and including myself, show that Turkey's rate of increase, long run rate of increase of total factor productivity is less than 1% per year, 0.8%, okay? But of course, since total factor productivity growth is closely related to GDP growth, there is a strong correlation. But these fluctuations in total factor productivity growth also lead to the similar cycles. And here you can see the same cycles I identified earlier with respect to GDP per capita. You can see that with respect to total factor productivity growth or quality of growth. So what we find here in each of these four cycles is a period, an early period of high quality growth or high growth, followed by period of low GDP per capita growth and low, even negative total factor productivity growth. This is the first one is for the 1950s. And then there's another, the second cycle is from 1960 to 1980, the third cycle from 1980 to 2001. And we are currently in the later stages of the fourth cycle. But again, in each of these cycles, periods of high growth, higher quality growth are followed by lower quality growth, and sometimes negative, zero or negative total factor productivity growth. This, in this slide, I tried to discuss a little bit the causal mechanisms in each of these four cycles. I begin my story with, for each of these four cycles, I begin my story with relatively weak political and economic institutions at both the macro level and micro level. Things go well early on. As I referred to in these early years, high economic growth, high quality growth. But then things begin to change rising political competition or rising tensions, or sometimes economic mismanagement. Sometimes economic governments are impatient, or they want to favor growth today, and they push the economy to levels of unsustainable growth. Either way, over time, as these problems rise, there is a decline in quality of economic policy. Macroeconomic policy favors more growth today, expansionary fiscal policy, expansionary monetary policy. Decline in quality of microeconomic policy means more favoritism, more corruption, greater misallocation of resources. And these lead to poorer, weaker economic outcomes. Decline in the quality and quantity of private investment. And then we find also in these second periods, in these later stages, higher rates of inflation. Just to give you some sense, I calculated the average rate of inflation in the early period of these 4 cycles and compared it with the average rate of inflation in the later stages of the cycle. Of course, Turkey's inflation rates are not really comparable with that of Germany or the Eurozone. We are a high inflation country. Anyway, in the lower phase of the cycle, in these lower phases of the cycle, the average inflation rate in Turkey since 1950 has been 18%. But in these more difficult later stage, in the second subperiod of these 4 cycles, inflation rate has been 33%, full 15% higher, 15% per annum higher in each. And of course, as I pointed out, lower total factor productivity growth, lower GDP growth. And of course, if this cycle continues, which often it leads to further decline in political and economic institutions, may lead to banking crises, foreign exchange crisis. And in the last 3 cycles, each of these cycles ended with an intervention by the IMF. Governments in Turkey sought the help of the IMF to pull themselves out of the crisis, and or they have led to, in 1960 and in 1980, to military coups. And then each of these cycles, after the IMF intervention, we go back to the beginning of the next cycle. So this is the pattern I have identified in Turkey's recent past. And again, I want to summarize by pointing out to the decline in the quality and quantity of private investment, meaning sectoral. In the good times, investment goes to manufacturing. In the bad times, goes to services and more poorer, lower productivity sectors. And combined with relatively lower levels of education, this has led to a lower technology content, lower technology economy. And as I mentioned, decline in state capacity and quality of state interventionism is also associated with these cycles. So I would say that if Turkey had been able to had a more stable political regime, stronger political institutions, it would have done better. Turkey has done about average, a little above average. Turkey would have done significantly better if its political institutions and political regime was stronger. And finally, I would say that this, what I identified here, has relevance for many other developing countries. Okay, thank you very much. I am now happy to respond to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive view of Turkey's economic history. And I think we are so many participants. Could you please use the chat function and just put a star in? I think Jan has already done so, so he will have the first question. So, and then there's others. So just type a star into the chat, and I will then give you the word. And the first question here is from Jan Logeman.
Yeah, my audio. Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much for this really interesting talk and then this really broad survey of economic development in Turkey, which is yeah, it's fascinating to see these cycles that you identified and then the factors that you kind of look at. I think that sounds, you know, for the outsider at least quite convincing. I have a question about one factor that you didn't really mention, but that comes to mind, at least from the German perspective, if you think of Turkey and economic development, and that's migration. The impact that migration has in terms of human capital development, and I think both of kind of emigration, out-migration, and maybe return migration. If you look at German economic history in the 1950s onwards, the post-war era, migration is receiving a lot of attention at the moment in historiography as a means of kind of thinking about German economy in more transnational terms. You know, the labor influx from countries like Italy, but especially Turkey as well, was very important for understanding economic growth in this time period. But also here at the Institute, we study immigrant entrepreneurship, so the entrepreneurial aspects and the kind of know-how transfers that come with migration that are important for economies. So would you see this as a factor for the Turkish development as well, with having large out-migration for a while, and then maybe also kind of knowledge transfers through return migration? Does that, or is that something that doesn't really show up in your data because it's not quantifiable enough in many ways?
Thank you for this question. Even if it doesn't show up in the GDP but I am familiar with studies on immigration, and so I will try to answer your question based on other studies and what I know of Turkey's economic history. Now, as you have emphasized, when you look at 20th century or since the period since 1950, the period from 1960 to 1975, these 15 years stand out as special in terms of emigration of the Turkish labor force to Western Europe, Germany and other countries, because that was a period of huge boom for Western Europe, and there was huge demand for workers. I was a school age person at that time, and I remember very well this period. But in later years, the recession in Europe has really shut that door. That the recession after 1973 gradually closed the door to European economies, really did not want to continue accepting migrant workers. So, and there have been other episodes, but they are smaller in magnitude. Turkey has also sent workers to various Middle Eastern countries after 1980s, but the numbers are small. And what are the consequences? Of course, I can talk about the consequences for Turkey's economy. Certainly, emigration, in the rapid emigration, significant volumes of emigration in the 1960s and early 70s has taken off the pressure, the unemployment pressure, and has allowed for significant inflows of remittances to Turkish economy until the 70s, through the 70s. But did Turkey use
unfortunately, your microphone is muted.
Yeah, you have to switch on the microphone again, and somehow it's yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, is it just the last sentence you want me to repeat?
Maybe
I would say
you talked about remittances, and then
Turkey has not been very successful in using these remittances for the long term. The remittances came to help Turkey in the short term, but of course it requires skilled government policy to be able to direct them in the longer term. We do have examples of returning workers who brought and established enterprises after they returned and so on. But on the whole, there have been benefits, but Turkey, I would say, could have done a much better job. But on the whole, 70s was not politically a good time. The 70s coincides with the second part of my cycle, right? And this is the time when remittances stopped. And of course, as you know better than I do, the Turkish workers in Europe over time began to send less and less to Turkey in the form of remittances. Rather, as they settled, they began to use their savings in Europe. So there is a period, late 60s, early 70s, and through the 70s, when the remittances even accounted for even more than export revenue. For a few, 3, 4, 5 years, remittances were greater than export revenue for Turkey. But of course, now remittances are less than 1/10, less than 1/20th of export revenue. So I would say Turkey's economy benefited, but would have benefited more had the policies been more effective.
Okay, the next question will be asked by Bruno Witzel.
So, Professor Pamuk, thank you very much also from my side. It's a pleasure to be here today, also because I know your work from my own time as a PhD student. And this is actually my first question, which is more of a curiosity. So you presented quite some interesting data in terms of GDP per capita over the very long run. So I'm asking this because I know your other work in terms of real wages for the Ottoman Empire for the very long run. So I would just like, so if you could please mention a little bit of the methodology that you used in order to construct those figures. So that's more of a curiosity from my side. And then my main question refers to the cycle or to the cycles that you identified. And it seems to me that Turkey is a clear case of like being trapped in this middle income trap that we also have for other parts of the world. And when listening to your presentation, especially the last part of it, I was thinking mostly about Latin America and also South Africa, basically due to low scores in terms of political stability, or this inward orientation and this failure to go for outward orientation. So my question here is basically if you think that Turkey is more or less in the same type of middle income trap. And well, I know that this is too much of a broad question, but what could those countries do in order to break this trap, to break out of this trap?
Okay, thank you very much. I think these are both very good questions, and it gives me an opportunity to respond. As the question by Jan, I think I took a long time to answer his question because I know for the audience that that's an important part of Turkey's economic history. Now, with respect to my methodology, I was unable to spend much time on the methodology because I had limited time. But I would say, okay, let me say this, that most of my data for all the other countries for the world in my graphs are based on the Madison project, okay? In fact, I am a member of the Madison project. I helped with all the estimates of the Madison GDP project for Middle East, okay? And I'm still on the board. So I took all of the Madison numbers for all the other countries, and then to them I added Turkey. Of course, for the 20th century, we have the official series. For 19th century, I used my own estimates. So it's really, I didn't do all of that myself. It's the Madison project. Madison did that for the last 30 years of his life. And now after he passed away, we continue this project and producing updates of these and going back in time. With respect to cycles, I agree with you that there are many similarities between what I observe, what I try to present today, and the so-called middle income trap. The idea that many developing countries have a difficult time increasing their total factor productivity growth and moving out of this middle range. And that perhaps they have some common problems. And perhaps I would say that these common problems are related to the politics and the quality of the institutions, the rules, interaction between politics, economy, and social structure. So this is a big, complex package that, right? It's not easy to break it down, but this is where a lot of things are happening. And in what I wanted to also argue that, at least in the Turkish case, whether Turkey pursued inward-oriented policies as it did until 1980, or whether it pursued outward-oriented policies, these cycles continued. So I suspect that these cycles were not due to whether it was inward-oriented or outward-oriented, but it was common to Turkey's package of politics and economy, how the two interact together. And some of these institutions, some of these, let's say, practices continued. I mean, today with so-called neoliberal era, but I mean, today we have lots of practices that existed before 1980, when we have lots of things about how government functions in the economy, what government does, how government influences winners, losers, and so on. In the new era after 1980, these were supposed to disappear and the government was supposed to get smaller. Well, none of that happened, or the government was not supposed to influence the winners and the losers, or the interventionism was going to decline and so on. None of that, in fact, today we have greater government interventionism, poorer quality of government interventionism, and so on, than perhaps any other time, or at least as much, certainly, probably more. So I agree with you. This is something common to many developing countries. Perhaps this is really part of what being a developing country is, that you don't, your politics is not settled enough to deal with these challenges. And if the politics is not settled enough and stable enough, small problems turn into big problems.
Okay, the next question comes from Serpil Karahan. So next in line, I might have mispronounced your name, Serpil Karahan.
I see her box.
Yeah, the box is there. I don't see the picture. Maybe
I'm not sure if it was a question.
It wasn't a question. Thank you very much.
Okay, no problem at all. Okay, so the next question comes from Timur Öztürk.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you very much.
Very good.
Okay,
Yeah, so,
Timur.
Yeah,
yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I enjoyed it very much. So I have a small question on inequality. What do we know about the general trends on inequality? Do you have any remarks on that? I mean, maybe the regional inequality is easier to determine because of the urban migration. But what do we know the inequality based on, for example, ethnicity?
What was the last word you used?
Ethnicity.
Inequality based on?
Ethnicity.
Huh.
Yeah, for an example.
Okay. Okay. Turkey has had very high levels of spatial inequality, regional inequality. And I have been working on this in recent years. We just completed a paper and sent it to a journal last fall. What is remarkable is that this high levels of regional inequality are not a recent phenomenon, but go back to the early 20th century, even late 19th century, okay? And of course, this is related ultimately with I think in the 20th century, in the 21st century, related to the location of industry, where industry is, where high paying jobs, higher productivity jobs are often determines spatial distribution of income. But of course, one of the ways this is perpetuated is the big differences in levels of education. There are big high levels of regional inequality in education persist as well. So I would say this is a complex problem in Turkey, and not the least, but it has historical roots. It has roots in the Ottoman era. I think Turkish Kurdish, the fact that many Armenians lived and then they disappear, were lost, that has had an impact, at least in the medium term. And then location of industry in the 20th century continued to concentrate in the northwestern part of the country. And people with higher education now, even if they come from other regions, continue to live there. So that tends to perpetuate these differences. But economists would also tell you that location of industry is never going to be equal. There's the new economic geography theories show that it's not equilibrium. These things do not tend towards equilibrium, but series of disequilibrium and these inequalities may persist. Turkey is a very striking case.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, the next question comes from Süleyman Topşoglu. You've already written a question, but maybe you wanna ask them. Süleyman, are you there?
I just wanted to know, you mentioned about agriculture decrease in Turkey, about the 1950.
Yes.
And I want to know, was it political decision or it was necessary? And my second question is about what's meaningful for Turkey to produce, or I just hear, just a second, I write it. It's, I must check it again. Okay. What's meaningful for Turkish economy to increase its stability?
Okay. Okay. Well, roughly until 1950, agriculture accounted for 80% of the labor force. In other words, almost 80%, 75, 80% of the labor force earned their income, lived in rural areas and earned their income from agriculture. But agriculture is a limited source of productivity growth, and also for individuals, families, people felt that after World War II, they wanted to look for better opportunities in the urban areas. So you find the two working together. People began to leave their villages, rural areas, and move to the urban areas after World War II. And when they arrived in the urban areas, a lot of those people went sooner or later to industry, some services, industry, and the productivity in those urban sectors, industry and services, was much higher than agriculture. So you have over time a rise in productivity and share of urban economy. Population is rising, but average incomes are also rising. But this is not unique to Turkey. This has happened in every single country. Or Germany had this, France had this, United States, everybody. It's just that it happened in different times in different countries. And Turkey, began a little late. Not saying that there was no migration before 1950, but migration accelerated or picked up after World War II. And for example, Italy the same.
I just want to jump in here. Is this really the same? I mean, in Germany, for example, in the 50s and 60s, the productivity in agriculture exploded.
Okay.
There was a very high growth rate, and so they could shed a lot of labor. Whereas I don't know enough about Turkish agriculture, but I mean, my impression is that here people left because it was more attractive to work in industry, while productivity in agriculture remained low or only increased slowly. Is this the right impression, or am I mistaken?
Roughly speaking, the numbers of people in Turkey's agriculture have remained little changed since 1950. They have changed a little bit, but the urban population has increased up more than tenfold. That's one way to look at it. The rural areas have been sending people off. And of course, the people who stay behind have rising incomes. But Turkey's agriculture is not the most dynamic sector. And you know, something in Turkey that's been happening is also happening in Europe. The average age of the people in rural areas has been rising. The young people are leaving for urban areas, for industry, services, getting better education. The relatively less educated parents are staying in the farm. Okay, I think this is also happening in Europe as well. The average age in the countryside is much higher now. Okay, Turkey's agriculture has not done wonders, but the family farm has remained intact, and the family farm is still the core of Turkey's agriculture, and the people in the family farm are older. In recent years, there has been greater emphasis on rather from cereals towards fruits, vegetables, more labor-intensive crops. So Turkey's countryside has been attracting a lot of migrant labor. The young people are leaving, so the parents have been hiring migrant labor. Who are the migrant labor? For a while, it was people coming from neighboring countries. More recently, people like Georgians, Syrians, Romanians, that kind of thing. I know German agriculture also receives lots of migrant workers to pick up the crops, and you get in the COVID, you got some workers from Romania and so on. So, okay, there are parallels, but obviously Turkey's agriculture is not at the high level of productivity and mechanization as German agriculture, but there are some common features.
Okay.
Let me just say something. The ideal for Turkey, Süleyman's question, the ideal for Turkey would be to develop more its manufacturing, educate its labor force better, and move more strongly towards higher tech, higher productivity areas. They need not be all in manufacturing, but manufacturing plus services, but higher productivity areas, higher tech areas, and also educate Turkey's labor force better. This would be the ideal scenario. And I would argue, in the spirit of my presentation today, Turkey's politics and its up and down cycles of Turkey's politics makes it very difficult to pursue a long-term stable strategy. Turkey's politics often imposes short-term solutions, favoritism, short-term macroeconomic policies, short-term or poor microeconomic policies. And so we never get around to pursuing this long-term vision of educating the labor force, quality education, and focusing more on higher productivity, manufacturing and services.
Okay, the next name on the list is Nasir. I'm sorry for maybe mispronouncing this. Yes.
Mm-hmm. My name is Nadia Göksu, but
okay, I'm so sorry.
It's okay. First of all, thank you for this event, and thank you, Professor Pamuk, for your presentation. I'm very happy to have met you in this event because you was one of the authors I have cited a lot in my bachelor thesis and also now in my master's thesis. I've got two questions. The first one is about the international economic policy or orientation of Turkey. We saw in your presentation that Turkey have followed, especially after 1980s, more Western-oriented economic policy and work together with the United States and the IMF and so on. And
your microphone is switched off.
Okay, go ahead.
Now, is it better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now it's okay.
Mm-hmm. And now in the last few years, Turkey followed a Western-oriented policy, and now in the last few years we can see that an orientation towards Asia, towards China is to recognize. Turkey got a lot of loans from the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, and maybe we can compare this to the credits we get from the IMF in fewer years. And what do you think about this reorientation? Is it a right step for Turkey, for Turkish economic policy, or or could we talk about a reorientation of Turkey towards Asia? And another question is regarding the high inflation rate in Turkey, especially now. We have these high inflation rates and also the high exchange rates with dollar, TL, and euro TL courses. And do you think that this problem could solve that easy, like most economics explained, with an interaction of interest rates, and that the inflation rate will increase then? Or for the case of Turkey, is it much more complicated? Which political which political steps could be taken to control this high inflation rate? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for these questions. Thank you. I think, both important. Turkey's long-term orientation. Okay. You know, at the beginning of this century, about 20 years ago, 20 years ago, Turkey formally became a candidate for European Union membership, became a candidate for membership. But it didn't work out. I think it didn't work out because both sides were responsible. I would say that at the end of the day, different European governments were not very enthusiastic about this. And the Turkish government also was not the AKP government was not enthusiastic. And now that this vision of membership is now in the past, we're very far from it. So in this respect, you could say that it's normal that Turkey should look for other kinds of linkages. I would say that the other alternatives are not as appealing and are not as strong for Turkey. Even if Turkey is not a member of the European Union, developing closer relations with China, which is far away, or with Russia, or the Middle East, they help, but they cannot replace the European Union, its technology, its markets, and so on. So I would say that Turkey's best strategy still lies with the European Union, and that Turkey should try to improve its relations with the European Union. For example, try to develop a better customs union arrangement. The existing customs union arrangement is not really working very well, or it is advantageous, but it's also has aspects that are not advantageous for Turkey. The point is, Turkey's other searcher, whether it's Russia, China, Middle East. They cannot, at the end of the day, they cannot replace the European Union. They cannot be a strong partnership. They can complement, but they cannot replace the European Union. But of course, relationship with the European Union is not only a economic relationship, it's also a political relationship. The high inflation rate, I think this is like a symbol, I think, for this is a symbol in Turkey for the quality of economic policy. When things begin to go wrong, when governments become impatient or have problems, then they pursue policies that end up with higher inflation, as I pointed out in my cycles framework. Reducing the inflation rate, bringing it down, and making inflation rate stable. It doesn't have to be down below 5%. 5%, single digits, but stable, requires patience, stable economic policy, and requires time. And Turkish economic governments, for example, AKP blamed coalition governments, other governments in the past, but they have had now, they've been in power 18 years and they've had a lot of time, but inflation rate this year is now 15%. So it's a measure, a good measure of the quality of economic policy. But I also suspect it's not only governments, perhaps Turkish society is a bit impatient. We want growth today, the next 3 months. We want jobs now, and the public measures government policy in terms of jobs today, and which may also encourage governments to develop very short horizon and pursue short-term policies. And that may be another reason why inflation rate has not been brought down and kept stable.
Okay, the next question is from Robert Bernsee.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Pamuk, for your very interesting presentation. So, well, my first question was about the quality of the state and the state capacity. And you mentioned that there was always some kind of a short side policy that is in a way important to explain the lower growth, as you did in your presentation. So, but I would be interested in another maybe part of the legal framework in Turkey. And you didn't mention a lot the property rights system in Turkey. And maybe, well, I could imagine that this maybe has a more like long-term stability in a way. So I would be interested, how would you describe or put the law enforcement and the property rights system in your explanation of the growth? Because you didn't mention that later in your presentation.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Yes. Let me just begin with the state capacity business. I would say that these cycles I have identified make it very difficult for the state to evolve into a positive and stable force for supporting economic development. This is, I find, to be the problem, because when things begin to go wrong, lots of the good, high-quality policies or postures or institutions are abandoned for short-term and poor quality favoritism, misallocation of resources. And of course, when a government puts its resources into favoring those who are close to it, there may be, that represents very low state capacity for economic development. The government certainly can redistribute, but government does not create capacity for economic development. That's how I see current government may have a lot of capacity for other things, but doesn't have high capacity for economic development. This is how I see it. And the rule of law, I agree, it's part of it. That we've seen in the last 10 years very bad examples of violation of property rights and rule of law. In fact, both in the economic area or in non-economic area, rule of law is really at a low point. At a low point, in the end, okay, rule of law. You need rule of law in the end for justice. Some of the very basic human things, very social things, political things. But you also need rule of law for economic development, because even if the judiciary system doesn't affect many other areas, it also affects the economy. And if the judiciary or the rule of law goes out the window in other areas, the private sector looks and takes note. The private sector says, even if it doesn't affect them, they say, well, what if these rule of law violations, what if these happen to us sometime in the future? So rule of law, when the rule of law declines, it has an effect on the economy, especially on private investment. Domestic private investment, also investment coming from abroad, but I think its impact on the domestic private sector is even more important. So we don't have that now.
Okay, I put my name on the list now. I just have a very small question. You mentioned the absence of colonial rule at the beginning as a negative factor.
No, I didn't say negative. I said just a factor. Just what kind of government? I didn't mention it as a negative. I didn't mention it as a negative.
But what is the planetary value? I mean, I'm not sure what you wanted to say. Is this an advantage or a disadvantage? Or
okay, good. Okay. As you know, in our literature, economic development literature, economic history literature, there's a lot of emphasis that for many countries in the developing world today, a large part of the institutions is due to the colonial legacy. Okay, so there's a large literature. The idea that in the colonial period, many of the institutions were established in today's developing countries. Well, it is not entirely true. The institutions were, even in the colonial period, the institutions were developed as an interaction between the colonial government and the local. But anyway, so I'm in the case of Turkey, it wasn't colonial legacy, it wasn't colonial governments, it's ultimately Turkey's own elites that did what they did in terms of institutional change, modernization, and so on. So this is a unique part of Turkey that if you look around the world, you find very few countries which do not have a colonial past. But I didn't say, certainly didn't say it's worse. I didn't necessarily say it's better. Yeah, probably in some ways it's better, but Turkey's domestic politics today is still subject to many of the same kinds of political problems that other developing countries with colonial pasts also experience.
I mean, is there a legacy of another kind? I mean, the Ottoman Empire has long been gone, but from what I read in the newspapers, there is a certain expansionism or a certain, I mean, not a way to reestablish this empire, but kind of, I mean, when you look at the conflict about the oil in the Mediterranean, is there some kind of legacy with the current government that comes from the wish to reestablish some of the old strengths and power, international power? I don't know. Just
okay, yeah. Well, Turkey's governments in the 20th century for a long time did not think about this creating or pursuing policies that would somehow represent some sort of a return or resurrection of its historical past, of its Ottoman past. Mm-hmm. This is ultimately a choice. This is not an inevitable legacy. Some governments choose to make something of it, and I suspect it is not purely for foreign policy purposes, but it's also for domestic consumption. If it plays to your base, if it plays to your political base, mm-hmm. then you try to get something out of it. I think there is some of that. I think to the extent that governments use this for domestic policy purposes, they try to use it. But I think these are not inevitable. These are not inevitable choices. That these are choices governments make for a mm-hmm. variety of reasons, and if a government thinks that they will get mileage for domestic political reasons, they will get mileage out of pursuing these kinds of policies, whether it's in the Middle East, North Africa, and so on. They will make extra effort for this.
Okay, I understand. The list is at the end, but we still have maybe 5 minutes. If there are other questions and remarks, please feel free to ask Professor Pamuk. Well, this doesn't seem to be the case, so I hand over. I mean, first of all, I'd like to thank you very much. This was really interesting, and we are really proud to have you here. And I pass over the words to Yagmur.
Thank you very much. Dear Professor Pamuk and dear Professor Berkhoff, on behalf of our association, I want to thank you for your insightful presentation and for your nice moderation. We have a kind certificate for each one of you. My colleague is sharing the screen now.
Okay.
We donated 6 seedlings in your names in Turkey as of our appreciation. we kindly ask you to receive our sincere thanks. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you very much,
you,
Professor Berghoff. And I want to thank the university for inviting me, and I want to thank Cenk Bey and the association also for the invitation. I enjoyed our conversation. I really did. And well, I should say this. Of course, when part of what I did presented today was in my book, my books, but these cycles about political cycles, I have the ambition to turn it into a publication sooner or later. So the discussion is also very helpful for me. I not only got to know a little bit of you, but I found our conversation this evening very, very fruitful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and yeah, I'd like to thank you for this wonderful idea, and it never happened to me before. So I think this is great. And again, thank you, Professor Pamuk.
I should mention that I received this of the association. I received this in the mail. The association sent me this. Okay, Yağmur, you probably know about this, and Cenk Bey knows about this. So I want to thank for this as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much once again for accepting our invitation and being here with us with this very insightful presentation. And as our closing remarks, I would like to thank all of our participations. As mentioned before, the recorded version of this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel shortly. For keep being updated of our future events, you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter. So we wish you a very nice evening. Guten Abend, vielen lieben Dank und iyi akşamlar.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a great,
Thank you.
great night.
Ya, iyi akşamlar.
Bye. Bye.
Hocam çok teşekkür ederim tekrar.
Ben de teşekkür ederim Cenk. Teşekkür ederim.
İstanbul'a selamlar hocam. Çok teşekkürler.
Teşekkür ederim. Çok. Ev sahipliğiniz için de teşekkür ederim. Thank you. Thank you all.
Siz de katıldığınız için teşekkürüz hocam.